Hey, boys and girls, you love your cell phones and your iPads? You want to keep those cell phones? You want to stop paying? I know you want to stop. You don't want to pay those fines here in the state, do you? Do you? Well, this is just a simple. Here's a simple thing from the state of Texas. Because this is Distracted Driver Awareness Month, and what they're doing is this. You ready, boys and girls? Take a seat. Come closer. Come closer. Closer. Come a little closer. A little closer. Come closer. Closer, closer, closer. You better put that phone away or you're going to pay for it. That's right. Yeah, if you put the phone away or you're gonna pay. The state of Texas is very serious about all of this. Let's take a look.
The month of April also recognizes Distracted Driving Awareness Month, and local law enforcement, TxDOT, and federal officials have started an enforcement campaign called Put the Phone Away or Pay. In 2022, distracted driving killed more than 3,300 people and injured nearly 300,000 more. Officials want you to stay off your phone while driving. It's recommended to put cell phones out of reach before you even start to drive. And if you have to send a text or talk to someone, pull over. And remember, state law bans the use of a handheld device when you are behind the wheel.
When you're behind the wheels, you do some people even follow the law? Nope. They just sit there and go, wah, boof. Thomas J. Henry can really help, but if he was here in this broadcast, he'd tell us some tips. If you're going to send in a very important text message or call somebody, you need to pull over to the side of the road. Don't pull up to the side of the curb. Find a parking space, and then you can call somebody. It's that simple. A good Samaritan would even know how to do it. It would even take a monkey to learn how to follow the law. It's just that simple. You put the phone away or you're going to pay. It's that simple. It's that simple. It's really that simple. And if you don't like it, well, tough. It's what they're doing. Alright, moving on now. 4 years ago, the dreaded COVID-19 pandemic kicked in this state and in this community. And with truancy happening, it was to where schools were doing remote learning. But that caused some issues, from failure to return to work by a certain time to even technical difficulties. But truancy was still on the rise then. And as you're about to hear from two area truancy judges from this report back in 2020, it was a very challenging time. Here's Nora Paris.
I've spoken to quite a few judges throughout Texas. We have over 1,000 truancy judges, and they're in the same boat.
Judge Joe Benavides talking about truancy cases and how they've risen during the pandemic. One cause, issues with students and parents keeping up with assignments while doing online classes. Parents say sometimes their kids are being counted absent when they've simply failed to turn in work by a certain time. Judge Benavides says he's heard many stories of families who are at the breaking point, dealing with job loss, illness, loss of childcare, and other issues that have been severely disruptive to their children's education.
There's teenagers working at Whataburger, working at Burger King, working at McDonald's. These kids are working because they're trying to help mom or dad pay the bills. You know, these are cases and cases of evictions right here and debt claims. It's really getting really bad. Parents on my side are struggling a lot.
Judge Thelma Rodriguez, who also hears truancy cases for CCISD and other districts in the area, says she and her fellow justices are handling these cases a little differently now, trying to help families who are struggling.
Mostly I'll doing deferred orders, which is like a probation period, and it's for counseling services to get with the students, virtual counseling services.
Both judges say they are trying to find nonprofit organizations, grants, and other community programs to help these families, most of whom are trying their best to see to their children's education in these extraordinary conditions.
We're not here to argue the child should be in school The parent should be behind the iPad with the child. We're just trying to find solutions.
Nora Bettis, 3 News.
And there is solutions that you can do that there was back then. Court orders are put in place. Those remedial orders. And if you remember from our Causes of Truancy episode from a couple seasons ago, COVID was at number 1 while bullying was at number 2. But with the pandemic ending, bullying was back at number 1. And the reason I had to put the pandemic at number 1 was because it was one of the causes of the pandemic. If you remember, truancy was on the rise because of the pandemic. And kids nowadays, they're working at Whataburger, Burger King, McDonald's, Long John Silver's to help out the parents pay the bills. I mean, these are the excuses that I put in the book for the truancy judge. It's like, why are you not going to school? Well, because I had to work to help my family. Okay, but that's not going to help. On a special Throwback Thursday, a look at the COVID-19 4 years later. Before we go on break, I had promised to tell you the story about Sammy the Bull. We're going to have that for you coming up on Wednesday and Friday. Or depend on one of the two. Or Wednesday, and then I'll let you know. I'll let you know in the end. But an issue is going on with tobacco. Now, years ago, you may remember there was a story on ABC's Day One, which we're going to show you all about the tobacco industry and how they were sued by Philip Morris. There was also the tobacco tapes, and the client and the lawyer who forbid one person from ever talking about the documents. Those stories are next. Those stories are coming up next, so stay with us. Tonight, an issue that could completely transform the tobacco industry. Years ago, the Surgeon General's report claimed that cigarettes were used as a drug because of one thing: nicotine. And news organizations like ABC, NBC, CBS have reported on issues about the tobacco industry, and one person, Brian Williamson. But this is not simply a story about Brian Williamson. This is a story about how tobacco is used to add a flavor to the cigarettes, and whether nicotine is addictive or not. Tonight, you're going to see the results of an extraordinary investigation that was done by ABC's Day One. And you can judge for yourself whether nicotine is a drug or not. Here's John Martin.
From these tobacco fields comes one of the world's most profitable and addictive substances. To many smokers, cigarettes are simply leaves rolled in white paper. In reality, cigarettes are a complex, scientifically engineered product about which little is known publicly.
Do you think the tobacco companies have been open and honest with people about what's in their product?
Absolutely not. In fact, they've done just the opposite. They've basically blocked any attempts for us to give an honest account of the American public of the ingredients within the product.
One ingredient contained in these tobacco leaves is known: nicotine. The 1988 Surgeon General's report identified nicotine as a highly addictive drug and said this is why smoking can be as difficult to quit as heroin or cocaine. One of the writers of the report was addiction expert Dr. Jack Henningfield.
The cigarette is essentially the crack cocaine form of nicotine delivery.
Now, a lengthy Day One investigation has uncovered perhaps the tobacco industry's last best secret: how it artificially adds nicotine to cigarettes to keep people smoking and boost profits. The methods the cigarette companies use to precisely control the levels of nicotine is something that has never before been disclosed to consumers or the government. For years, growing and blending tobacco was an art. But about 30 years ago, it began evolving into something quite different.
In Liggett and Myers' laboratory, modern science makes certain that the smoker gets precisely what he expects to get.
And one thing smokers are supposed to get is nicotine. That was made clear decades ago by a Philip Morris official. He wrote this confidential internal memo. Think of the cigarette pack as a storage container for a day's supply of nicotine. think of the cigarette as a dispenser for a dose unit of nicotine. Think of a puff of smoke as the vehicle of nicotine. It was here in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, that the manufacturing process began to change. The R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company pioneered a two-step process to make cigarettes more cheaply and to control the level of nicotine. Step one, it developed reconstituted tobacco, which is made from stalks and stems and other waste that it used to throw away.
The American public doesn't understand that the tobacco, it's not a natural tobacco leaf. So much of the cigarette is so-called reconstituted tobacco. It's a manufactured product.
Don Barrett sued the American Tobacco Company on behalf of a client who has since died of cancer. Barrett discovered a great deal about how cigarettes are manufactured.
They would take the material, the dust, the tobacco dust that fell on the floor, and they would sweep those up, and they would dump them in a big bin, and they would use that to make the so-called reconstituted tobacco.
The processes involved in controlling the nicotine level are company secrets. This former RJR manager asked to be interviewed in Silhouette.
On the average, the currently marketed brands contain about 22% reconstituted tobacco. The cut rate or generic brands typically contain usually about double that.
Day One commissioned a laboratory analysis that confirmed the industry's heavy use of reconstituted tobacco. In one brand from RJR, it comprised a quarter of the cigarette. In another, about a third. Even though reconstituted tobacco allows the companies to produce cigarettes more cheaply, there are problems. Poor taste and less nicotine. So here's what the companies do in step two. They apply a powerful tobacco extract containing nicotine and flavor to the reconstituted tobacco. This process too is meant to be secret. Of the 5 companies we contacted who supply the extract, only one would talk to us on camera.
The tobacco people are very secretive with what they use. Some of them, I would think, if you ask them whether they use tobacco, they might just say they don't, you know.
Van Nauheis is a vice president of Dr. Mattis Laboratories. He told us how they make this concentrated extract that is rich in nicotine.
You put the solvent on it, whatever solvent it is, water or alcohol, and then just percolate it. And after you percolate it, you concentrate it. It's basically the same if you're having a drip coffee pot. It's kind of a syrupy consistency, you know, like molasses.
Why would the tobacco companies use this nicotine-rich syrup?
They put nicotine in the form of tobacco extract into a product to keep the consumer happy.
They're fortifying the product with nicotine, is that correct?
The waste filler, yes they are.
Well, as you describe that, which I've heard for the first time, it makes my blood boil. Because what they are now selling is not a natural tobacco product which happens to have nicotine in it, but they are selling a nicotine dispenser. And that is quite different.
To try to verify that nicotine is being added to the reconstituted tobacco in cigarettes, we went to the American Health Foundation, a respected research center in Valhalla, New York. At Day One's request, the foundation separated and then analyzed the reconstituted tobacco portion of several brands of RJR cigarettes. Reconstituted tobacco ordinarily contains 25% or less of the nicotine in regular tobacco. But the samples we tested had up to 70% of the nicotine that would be found in regular tobacco. Bogdan Prokopchik performed the analysis.
No, I was kind of surprised because I expected it to be less. The most likely explanation is that some nicotine has been added, either with flavoring agents or by itself.
Why are you adding nicotine to your cigarettes?
We are not in any way doing that.
You're not adding nicotine?
No, we don't do that.
Joseph DiBathese and John Robinson are RJR scientists involved in tobacco research.
You know about tobacco extracts?
I do know about tobacco extracts. They're used as flavor materials, and it's very common in the tobacco industry.
Is there nicotine in those?
A water extract of tobacco would have nicotine in it.
How much?
And just like a water extract of the coffee bean would have caffeine in it.
So would this be a little bit or a lot?
it's hard for me to say. I don't know what a little bit or a lot would be. But I think that...
Well, how much does it have?
I think any company involved in the manufacture of tobacco and whose consumers are demanding a wide range of tar and nicotine products, they have blending and reconstituted tobacco techniques for reaching those, that range of tar and nicotine in their products.
But how much nicotine is added? The companies control the dosage precisely, according to this former RJR manager.
In commercially sold cigarettes, what percentage of tobacco extract is nicotine?
That really depends on what level the process calls for. In other words, I can say to you, I want it at 1%, I want it at 5%, I want it at 10%, I want it at 50%.
It's this ability to control the exact dosage of nicotine with tobacco extract that is so alarming to Dr. Greg Connolly, a Massachusetts health official.
Tobacco extract is taking nicotine out of tobacco leaf. It's a drug called nicotine. It's a euphemism. It's like calling heroin poppy seed oil. It's a drug, it's a drug, it's a drug.
Publicly, the companies say they are adding this extract just for the flavor, but there is evidence to contradict that. First, an extract industry manager told Day One, cigarette makers also use his product to give reconstituted tobacco a, quote, kick. That kick, he says, comes from nicotine. Second, even RJR's own researchers say they believe nicotine is a primary reason people smoke. They have identified nicotine's effect on the body, its ability to reduce anxiety and increase mental alertness. In this 1992 study, co-authored by RJR's Dr. Robinson, they wrote, "The beneficial effects of smoking on cognitive performance are a function of nicotine absorbed from cigarette smoke." In addition, patents owned by the cigarette companies show they are well aware of the science of dosing and delivering nicotine. According to this 1980 patent obtained by Day One, Lowe's, the parent company of cigarette maker Lorillard, held the rights to a system that is especially attractive in enriching the nicotine content of reconstituted tobacco. Dr. John Slade, an expert in nicotine addiction, has researched cigarette patents.
My conclusion from looking at this is that the tobacco companies have been doing this for a very long time, of fine-tuning the nicotine content of their products.
LTR Industries, a French subsidiary of Kimberly-Clark, even advertises in a trade journal that its process for treating reconstituted tobacco permits adjustments of nicotine to your exact requirements. There's another way nicotine is added to cigarettes, and it begins, perhaps surprisingly, at docks like this one in Newark, New Jersey. It is here that nearly pure nicotine is brought ashore to be combined with alcohol. It's called denaturing. The mixture can then be applied to tobacco during the manufacturing process, for among other things, flavoring. As these trucking records show, Philip Morris, for example, received thousands of gallons of this alcohol mixture during the 1980s. The cigarette makers say this mixture leaves only a tiny amount of nicotine on the tobacco. Still, any kind of nicotine manipulation disturbs critics like Cliff Douglas of the American Cancer Society.
The public doesn't know that the industry manipulates nicotine, takes it out, puts it back in, uses it as if it were sugar being put in candy. They don't have a clue.
Neither, apparently, do members of Congress.
Well, it disgusts me.
Were you aware of that?
No, I wasn't. They don't want anybody looking at their product. And the reason is exactly what you just went through. So that they can doctor it, they can alter it, they can do anything with it, and they can literally jeopardize the health of the American public without having any consequence.
The tobacco industry boasts that it makes cigarettes with various yields of nicotine, as demonstrated over the years when it tests them on a machine like this one. The industry says the availability of low-tar, low-nicotine cigarettes gives consumers a choice.
Scientifically, the low-tar, low-nicotine cigarette notion is basically a scam.
Jack Henningfield of the National Institute of Drug Abuse argues that these low yields, for the most part, are attained not by removing nicotine, but rather by using filters and air holes. But smokers get around this, he said.
They take a few extra puffs, they inhale a little bit more deeply, they beat the machine. They beat the cigarette, they get all the nicotine their body needs to maintain addiction.
Actually, if the companies wanted to take out all the nicotine, they could.
The truth is you could take all the nicotine out right now in cigarettes and sell them, couldn't you?
We have not done that.
But you could do it.
Well, as scientists and engineers here in R&D, I think that could be done. But I think the real issue here is that we, as a company, are providing a legal product to people who are looking for a pleasing sensory experience with mild pharmacology.
So why don't cigarette makers take the nicotine out of cigarettes?
Because they wouldn't sell cigarettes. If cigarettes didn't give you a bang, they wouldn't sell them.
Philip Morris knows this from its own experience. In 1991, it test-marketed Next, a denicotized cigarette that it withdrew from the market because without nicotine, few smokers would buy it. How tobacco companies manipulate nicotine and their reluctance to take it out strongly suggests that they want smokers to get nicotine, and they want them to get it in controlled doses. Several months ago, when we tried to get a reaction about all this from the Food and Drug Administration, the agency declined comment, but immediately sent out investigators to look into the matter on their own. Then, learning of our Day One broadcast tonight, the FDA sent out this letter on Friday. Quote, "Evidence brought to our attention is accumulating that suggests the cigarette manufacturers may intend that their products contain nicotine to satisfy an addiction. That's why the FDA says it may have the legal basis on which to regulate these products."
If the industry could put nicotine into Nabisco shredded wheat and get compulsive breakfast eaters, I'm sure they'd do it.
But they can't, of course. That's because nicotine is regulated in every other form, including nicotine patches and nicotine gum, which people use to quit smoking. Cigarettes are the exception. That's because the tobacco industry has been highly successful in getting Congress to protect it from regulation, according to Dr. Conley, the Massachusetts health official.
They exempted the cigarette from the Federal Hazardous Substances Act, Controlled Substances Act, Toxic Substances Act, Consumer Product Safety Act. Every major piece of health legislation since 1964 has had a specific exemption for cigarettes.
The lobby of tobacco is probably one of the most pervasive lobbies in Washington, D.C. Wherever two members of Congress are gathered together, you can probably find tobacco money.
But the FDA has indicated it doesn't need Congress's permission to act, though it wants its guidance. Even without legislation, the FDA believes it already has the legal authority to act on its own. And given the evidence now under consideration, the agency could ban all cigarettes with addictive levels of nicotine. In other words, virtually every single cigarette on the market.
I would think that if I were the administrator of FDA, and I learned that nicotine was being added to cigarettes to increase the amount of nicotine present, that I would view that cigarette as a delivery device for the use of nicotine, which is, under ordinary circumstances, a prescription drug. And I would think that demanded regulation.
John, this is really a remarkable story, but regulation is a very big word. When they talk about regulating the cigarette industry, what do we mean?
It means that the cigarettes would have to be certified as safe and effective as any other drug is by the Food and Drug Administration.
What about the cigarettes being sold today? Can they be certified?
Many of them could not because they have higher levels of nicotine than the Surgeon General has said is addictive, and certainly the FDA would have them banned on the market.
Remarkable. What does the tobacco industry say about all this?
Well, they say they're not really adding nicotine, that they're moving it from one part of the tobacco product to another. And they presumably could offer a cigarette that is simply the leaf and not this reconstituted filler material. However, that would raise the amount of nicotine, and it probably wouldn't help them avoid regulation.
Well, obviously there's a lot more to come here. You're still working on this story.
We're going full speed ahead this week.
And we will watch.
And they went full speed ahead with this. But what about the list of ingredients besides nicotine? Coming up next, the list. No one knows about the list, but you will see that list of the ingredients. And later on, two Kentucky people tell their side about why they would not speak about tobacco documents. Stay with us. Now, the list. the list of ingredients that was put in by the tobacco industry. And if you've been watching part 1 of this investigation, this is part 2 of that tobacco investigation. So once again, here's John Martin.
It was a long time coming for anti-smoking advocates. After years of frustration, they are suddenly hopeful, calling members of Congress.
I'm calling to talk to you about what the FDA is planning to do in light of what's happening. I just wanted to kind of give you an update.
The dam is broken and the floodwaters are spilling out, and we're trying to respond as best we can.
Last week, Day One reported for the first time evidence that cigarette companies manipulate levels of nicotine, a highly addictive drug, to keep people smoking. We found manufacturers add nicotine in carefully calibrated doses to fortify the tobacco waste products they insert in cigarettes and to replenish nicotine lost in processing.
The public doesn't know that the industry manipulates nicotine, takes it out, puts it back in, uses it as if it were sugar being put in candy. They don't have a clue.
The FDA letter 10 days ago cited evidence suggesting that nicotine is used to satisfy an addiction of some smokers. The cigarette makers deny the charges. They contend nicotine is not even addictive. Besides, they say, they do not increase the nicotine in cigarettes above what is found naturally in tobacco. Following our broadcast, editorial writers started asking questions. A House subcommittee scheduled hearings late this month to examine the industry's use of nicotine. In the Senate, Ted Kennedy asked the General Accounting Office to investigate nicotine manipulation by cigarette companies.
My sense is that if the investigation by the governmental agency provides the Congress and the American people with the facts on this, as brought out during your excellent report, that, I believe, can be the straw that breaks the back of the real power of the cigarette industry.
There's no better example of that power than the story of the list of additives manufacturers put in cigarettes. Under the law, the list is provided to the government, but kept secret from American consumers. What's on the list and what's not on it tell much about the power of the tobacco lobby, its demands for secrecy, and the government's failure to regulate this industry. Congressman Ron Wyden has seen the list.
We now know that there are chemicals in tobacco products that are so toxic they wouldn't be allowed in a landfill under the federal environmental rules.
Even so, consumers can't find out what those chemicals are.
It's a felony offense for me to reveal to you or to the public or to a smoker who is interested what ingredients are actually included in tobacco.
Michael Erickson heads the Federal Office of Smoking and Health. It's part of the Department of Health and Human Services. He knows what additives are in cigarettes because each year tobacco companies are required by law to give him the list. He, in turn, can share that list only with certain government officials. Why? Brennan Dawson represents the cigarette companies for the Tobacco Institute.
The industry, like any other industry of consumer products, wants to make sure that those things that are trade secrets are kept as trade secrets.
Well, a lot of the food products that we see have ingredients, and they list the ingredients. Sometimes they even list the percentage of ingredients.
And and in that list of ingredients, you'll see words like flavorings, where the manufacturers are not required to, in fact, turn over what can only be termed a recipe.
I don't think anyone's asking for the recipe.
The manufacturers provide the list to the federal government.
Could the President of the United States look at the list if he wanted to see it?
He would probably have to be designated as an employee of the Department of Health and Human Services to look at the list.
Ron Davis was Michael Erickson's predecessor, running the Office of Smoking and Health.
I think it's absurd that a product that's used by 45 million Americans is used by those people without them knowing what's in the product.
The list of additives is so secret that Dr. Davis was required to keep it under lock and key.
Outside my office, the director's office, was the safe.
The safe?
The safe. It took me 3 or 4 minutes to get into the safe. It's not just the normal lock where you have to turn to 3 different numbers.
The Office of Smoking and Health, now headed by Dr. Erickson, is located here in Atlanta. When Day One asked to videotape the safe, The staff member assigned to show us around wouldn't even tell us in which locked room it was located. When we asked him why, this was his response.
Can you tell me why you can't show it to us?
I will lose my job. This has the sound of the Cold War, nuclear weapons. Need to know. How can that be compatible with a health organization that's trying to protect the citizens?
It implies that our society will be irreparably damaged if somehow people find out what the cigarette companies are putting in cigarettes, which is absurd.
So, what is actually on the list? As many as 700 additives to cigarettes. Dr. Erickson offered one clue about what he called a special category.
There were 13 ingredients that are not allowed to be added to food, but which are added to cigarettes.
Day One has learned that 2 of those 13 additives should have tipped off the government to the tobacco industry's manipulation of nicotine in cigarettes. Those 2 ingredients are tobacco extract, which frequently is rich in nicotine, and nicotine sulfate, or salt. The list has contained these items for at least 2 years, yet the government did nothing about them.
It's inexcusable that government scientists haven't acted before now to take strong action demanding that that nicotine either be removed or that regulatory authority over tobacco products be expanded. It's inexcusable.
The government just didn't do its job, is what you're saying.
The government just didn't do its job. It is absolutely correct.
We called around Washington to find out why the list was apparently ignored by the people who could have done something with it. The Surgeon General, on the job 6 months today, hadn't been briefed on the list. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, who technically receives the list, has the authority to warn the country about dangerous ingredients, but never has. The law firm that compiles the list for the large tobacco companies declined to talk on camera. Until now, the idea here in Washington seems to have been worry about the smokers, but spare the tobacco companies.
The cigarette industry reminds me very clearly of the National Rifle Association. The power of an industry of extraordinary corporate wealth and influence.
How did this list come about in the first place, and why is it secret? For years, what health advocates really wanted was a law requiring a list of ingredients on every pack of cigarettes. But the tobacco companies resisted. So about 10 years ago, in a compromise arranged through Congress, the companies agreed to give the government the list, but not consumers. It was up to the government to do something with the list, but it never did.
The public health community demanded of the government scientists that they do something with that list, or if they didn't have the resources to do it, that they publish the list so that those of us in the private sector could do the research. Nonetheless, DHHS every year said, no, it's our responsibility, we can't release the information, and we'll get to it when we have time. They never found the time.
Why wasn't Congress rushing to use the list to learn more about a product that kills 400,000 Americans every year? Ask Dr. Sidney Wolfe, a leading public health advocate.
One would have to look at the 30 years since the Surgeon General's report and say the tobacco industry has had nearly perfect victory record in terms of defeating any kind of legislation that's come across. And the way in which they've done it is by buying up members of Congress.
A study by Dr. Wolfe showed the tobacco industry gave millions of dollars in campaign contributions to Congress, to tobacco state members and key leaders. Among the top recipients, Senate Minority Leader Bob Dole, House Majority Leader Richard Gephardt, and House Ways and Means Chairman Dan Rostenkowski. The tobacco lobby also taught public figures that taking on tobacco can be dangerous to your political health. Joseph Califano was Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in Jimmy Carter's cabinet when he attacked the cigarette makers.
It ultimately cost me my job as Secretary of HEB. I remember Senator Kennedy said to me, there's no way the president can run for re-election with you in the cabinet. Speaker O'Neill told me that. But I want to say something important about President Carter. Since then, he has talked to me. Indeed, he said to me, you were right and I was wrong about cigarettes.
Califano says the FDA's announcement that it might regulate cigarettes indicates that Commissioner David Kessler may lead a turnaround inside the government.
I wish that when I had been secretary, we had been imaginative enough thoughtful enough and aggressive enough to do what he did in his stand on nicotine, and in what I think will spark now major congressional activity.
And as far as I'm concerned, what needs to be done next is to make that list public. The public has a right to know.
That, in turn, could force the tobacco industry to do something it has never before been required to do.
The tobacco industry is the only industry in this entire nation that is permitted to put chemicals and other additives into its product without first proving that those chemicals are safe and effective.
All of this means the tobacco companies may also face new challenges in court. If juries decide the companies are intentionally addicting people, smoking victims could claim hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. Until now, the cigarette companies have managed to protect themselves from lawsuits, from regulators, and especially from Congress. But that may be changing.
In order to make progress in terms of legislation, you have to have that real support of the American people, that willingness to override the power of the special interest. And that is going to be the basic question, whether we'll be able to get that kind of support.
Hi, I'm calling from the American Heart Association, and I was hoping that I could come in and talk to you about a bill that we've been working on with Congress.
Well, John, let's focus on this secret list. I want to be clear about it. It has been in government hands for really a very long time.
For 8 years for us, the tobacco companies have been dutifully turning it over to the government for 8 years.
So then why haven't government researchers sat down with the list and started going over it to find out exactly what it is all about?
Ron Davis, who headed that office, told me that he asked for the money. They had estimated it would cost $500,000 to $1 million to analyze all those additives and to come up with a real report. He was told it's not a priority, we don't have the funds for it.
Well, you know that there are an awful lot of independent people who would like to have a chance to sit down and pore over it. Is there any possibility that the public is going to be able to see what's really on this list?
There is one possibility, and it's being talked about in Congress. Some in Congress are thinking of stepping onto the floor of the House and simply reading the list one by one, about 700 items, into the congressional record.
Good report, John. You've got more to come. John Martin, thanks very much.
Wow. Now, coming up next, these two people from Kentucky. One is a client and one is an attorney. One of the tobacco companies went to the Kentucky court to put a gag order on this man who ever speaking about the documents, including the lawyer. What do they have to say for themselves? Their story when we return. Stay with us. The list. The ingredients. We're talking about cigarettes and the tobacco industry. Why they are winning all these lawsuits. Now comes the icing on the cake. You're about to meet two lawyers who were put under a gag order by Brown and Williamson, who simply say they didn't want them talking about it. Otherwise they'll suspend their rights. Here's my boss.
Confidentiality agreement with still in force?
Yes, it is.
So that what are they going to do? Sue you for making this appearance?
I would bet on it.
The former executive has reason to bet on being sued, for major cigarette manufacturers have an impressive track record in court. They have defeated virtually everyone who has sued them over the health effects of tobacco. And they have used the courts, some would say, to intimidate the media and others from reporting on the health effects of tobacco use.
Tonight, a day one investigation that could completely transform the tobacco industry.
One ingredient contained in these tobacco leaves is known: nicotine. The 1988 Surgeon General's report identified nicotine as a highly addictive drug and said this is why smoking can be as difficult to quit as heroin or cocaine.
News organizations got the message when Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds brought a lawsuit in a Richmond, Virginia court against ABC News. That lawsuit demanded over $10 billion in damages. Murray Bring is the general counsel of Philip Morris.
Philip Morris filed a $10 billion lawsuit against the American broadcasting companies and several ABC employees for false and defamatory statements made on ABC's Day One news show and other news programs.
ABC had alleged that the tobacco companies spiked the nicotine levels in their cigarettes, implying they added nicotine to their products from outside sources. And ABC settled the case, apologizing for using that word.
ABC News agrees that we should not have reported that Philip Morris and Reynolds add significant amounts of nicotine from outside sources. That was a mistake that was not deliberate on the part of ABC, but for which we accept responsibility and which requires correction. We apologize to our audience, Philip Morris and Reynolds.
ABC also agreed to pay for the legal fees incurred by Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds, reportedly over $15 million. And Philip Morris advertised the ABC apology in newspapers around the country. Nonetheless, ABC News, in its apology, continued to maintain that the tobacco companies, quote, control the levels of nicotine in cigarettes in order to keep people smoking, close quote. Many in the media and the legal community thought that ABC had a very strong defense, but that the fear of losing a multi-billion-dollar judgment in a state where tobacco was a major employer apparently was enough for ABC's top management to settle out of court. The hardball tactics of the cigarette industry are understandable given the increasing pressure against smoking and smokers. The companies are fighting for their economic lives, and their tactics sometimes result in some bizarre situations. Take the case of this man, Merrill Williams. Williams worked as a paralegal in Louisville, Kentucky, in a firm that represented the Brown & Williamson Tobacco Company. Williams walked off with 4,000 pages of Brown & Williamson files, including some of their most revealing top-secret documents. Brown & Williamson went into a Kentucky court to put a gag order on Williams that prevented him from talking to anyone, including this man, his own attorney, Fox DeMoisey, about those documents. Do you want to tell me anything, Mr. Williams, about these documents?
He cannot. He's prohibited from making any public statement about the documents or his employment, anything he learned during his employment, or anything he learned as a result of what he learned from the employment.
What would happen to him if he talked to me now about those documents?
He very well could go to jail for 6 months.
Say this again?
There is presently pending a motion by Brown & Williamson to hold Merrill in criminal contempt. And even under that circumstance, I'm still not allowed to talk to my client, even though there's now the certain criminal trial.
I don't understand. You're not allowed to talk to your client. You're sitting with your client right now. And you're not permitted, despite the fact that you represent him.
Oh, I can ask him about the Reds and what he thought of the World Series and things like that.
But you cannot.
About the guts of the case, the documents, what did you do, why did you do it? It's been our position that Jeffrey Dahmer killed and ate people. And he
killed and ate people.
Right.
The serial killer.
Correct. And he had counsel, complete access. Albert James had sold our country's national security secrets. He had counsel. The lesson to be learned here is that, you can kill and eat people, you can sell national security stuff, and you're entitled to counsel. But if you take Brown & Williamson's documents, your rights are suspended.
Copies of the documents that Merrill Williams took, along with others from inside the tobacco industry, were leaked and were then made public in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Journal of the American Medical Association, as well as on the Internet. Nonetheless, Merrill Williams still cannot talk about them. But Professor Stanton Glantz, who says he got copies of the documents from an anonymous source, can talk about them. Dr. Glantz is a professor at the University of California Medical School in San Francisco. Professor Glantz, who is not constrained by a confidentiality agreement or a gag order, led a team of scientists in analyzing the Brown & Williamson documents, and that analysis was published in the AMA Journal. Documents which, without saying so outright, seem to confirm that the tobacco companies themselves were well aware of the potentially harmful effects of smoking. What is the story that the documents told you?
Well, they told me several things. First of all, they told me that 30 years ago, Brown & Williamson and British American Tobacco, its parent, knew nicotine was an addictive drug and acted on that knowledge. They knew smoking caused cancer and other diseases, and they acted on that knowledge.
What do you mean they acted on that knowledge?
They undertook very sophisticated research initially, internally, to try to reduce the level of cancer-causing agents in the cigarette smoke and to make the cigarettes safer. And they also developed very sophisticated legal strategies to to keep this information away from the public, to keep this information away from public health authorities.
What kind of sophisticated legal strategies?
They routed the sensitive materials through the legal department so they could then claim they were covered by attorney-client privilege and refused to produce them to the courts and to public authorities.
Dr. Glantz, an anti-tobacco activist, put copies of the 4,000 pages from Brown and Williamson, together with thousands of other pages obtained by the Congress, onto the shelves of the university library. But the University of California was then sued by Brown and Williamson, demanding that the university remove those documents from the library. But Brown and Williamson was unsuccessful. Dr. Glantz told us that the documents from Brown and Williamson raise yet another critical issue: the additives, the flavorings, and other compounds the tobacco companies put in their products.
When you put additives in the cigarettes, you then burn them, and in the process of burning them, they change.
And Dr. Glantz gave us a stunning example.
For a while, they were using Freon, the thing they used to use in refrigerators, as a way of puffing up the tobacco, of what they called expanding it, so to make it so it didn't weigh as much. Turns out when you burn Freon, you get phosgene, which is nerve gas.
And it appears from the document, says Professor Glantz, that Brown and Williamson was concerned about the scientific theory that the small amounts of phosgene in cigarette smoke could possibly pose a health risk to smokers.
But at least over the period of time covered by the documents, even despite that, they continued using the Freon process.
To this day?
I don't know.
And as the Wall Street Journal reported last month, tobacco companies use ammonia as an impact booster for the nicotine in cigarettes. Dr. Glantz says that according to documents from inside Brown and Williamson, the company is in the business of selling nicotine, in effect producing a nicotine delivery device.
In the documents, they say that over and over and over again.
Am I taking this too seriously? I mean, it's like sticking something in your arm.
Well, it is, except inhaling it gets it to your brain faster than sticking it in with a needle. And that's why smoking something is the most addicting way to use a drug. That's why crack cocaine is more addictive than snorted or injected cocaine.
Because that gets to your
brain faster. It goes to your lungs, it's absorbed very fast, and within a few seconds it gets to your brain. If you inject it with a needle, you don't get the hard hit that you get when you smoke it.
Dr. Stanton Glantz's articles in the AMA Journal appear to have had interesting results. In Congress, where the tobacco industry has a lot of clout, in this year's budget for the National Cancer Institute, the House of Representatives took unprecedented action, eliminating just one grant, Dr. Glantz's. Scientists from around the country have protested so far to no avail.
One of the reasons...
The power of the tobacco industry to keep its documents secret was demonstrated last July by Congressman Henry Waxman of California, who read from Philip Morris documents on the floor of the House, explaining he could only read them there because he had immunity from being sued for anything he said on the floor of Congress. Meanwhile, there is a federal investigation in New York and Washington about whether these men, who at the time headed the country's major tobacco companies, whether any of these men lied to Congress when they testified about whether or not the nicotine in their tobacco products was addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive, yes.
Mr. Johnston.
Congressman, cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction. There is no intoxication.
We'll take that as a no.
I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive. I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
And I too believe that nicotine is not addictive.
And they probably do believe that nicotine is not addictive. But there's still more to the case than meets the eye. But we're probably not going to have enough time to tell you that story. We're going to have that for you probably coming up tomorrow morning. And if that happens, we'll let you know. We're going to take a break. We're going to take a break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Did you know you can legally skip school if you provide excused absences? If it's for religious reasons or something else. If it's for religious reasons or family emergencies, okay, but you got to provide some documentation And as Law by Mike report tells us, it can really help. Take a look.
Allowed to skip school. Yo, T. 3 insane things you can actually break through Tia. 3 ways you're legally allowed to skip school.
Yo, Teach, they just said they're not going to let me walk in graduation. They said that you marked me absent too much.
Yeah, that's what happens when you're absent.
Mike.
Number 1, if you do have to miss class, make sure it's within your school's list of approved excused absences. Things like being sick, seeing a doctor, religious holidays, and family emergencies.
See, you can't flunk me because I'm sickly, religious, and my family's in shambles.
Oh, sure. Like, I haven't heard all those excuses before. Number 2, always provide evidence of your excused absence with proper documentation, like a doctor's note or a letter from your parents.
Here's my doctor's note, here's my bill from the hospital, and here's my dad.
Yeah, we're really religious, and a lot of extended family are dropping like flies.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, my son told you already. We're sickly people. Look, anyone can come in here with fake notes. There's no way this hospital bill is real. I can assure you that's a real bill, and his real father is standing right in front of me, paid actor.
Who hurt you?
And number 3, if your teacher still won't excuse the absence, you can challenge the record with the school district.
Mr. Eckham, these absences are excused.
Fine.
And go to therapy.
Go to therapy. But besides, like, the doctor's notes, let's look at the list of excuse. Let's look at some examples of excused absences. Examples of this: illness, medical, dental, family emergency. Illness. It's a common excuse that schools usually accept. A student is absent for more than 3 days and may need to provide a note from the doctor. Medical and dental appointments. It is recommended to make these appointments outside of school hours. A family emergency. This could include a funeral or other family event. Religious instruction. This could include observing a religious holiday or event, attending religious retreats. Court appearances. This could include requiring county or state court appointments or court-ordered family visitations. Other circumstances, this could include participation in school-sponsored activity or activities related to the child, to CPS, or the juvenile justice system. Other examples include driver's license tests, college visits for juniors and seniors only, pursuing establishment in a branch of the U.S. Armed Forces, student participating in sounding tasks, military honors, death of an immediate family member, and quarantine of the student or the immediate family. And like we talked about in our excuse versus excuse segment, I recommend you go with your excused absences. You throw in unexcused absences, those can be forged. So if you went to a doctor's note, you got to provide them with if you went to the doctor, you have to provide the school with a doctor's note. If not, it can be unexcused. I've got a perfect attendance from 2010 to 2012, and I remember having one unexcused absence when I was a senior. Remember this. This was 2016. It was the last day of school. Or it was last day of school, last day of second semester, first semester. I don't remember. If you went to Flower Bluff High School, there were these exemptions to where you'd be exempt for your semester exams. Where you had one excused absence, one A, like A's and 3 A's, this and this number of unexcused absences, this and that, then you'd be exempt. However, that didn't happen for me because of something that happened on Friday. So I went to one of my teachers and was like, okay, what are we doing this day? So threw out there, hey, we wanted a field trip that day. And they fixed it. I probably got my credit, or I probably got my credit, but in the end, teacher was like, okay, your exam, just go, you're on your phone quietly while everyone takes their exam, blah, 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 blah. And what I learned is if you want to raise your grade even better, you can actually take the exam. Freshman year, I was exempt from all my semester exams. Sophomore, exempt from all my exams. Junior year, I had to take the aquatic semester exam. Senior year. In previous years, we couldn't even do our semester. We couldn't even do the semester test. We weren't even exempt. So, it comes to show you that excused absences are important. And don't be forging any doctor's notes. You try to forge a doctor's note, and they can come after you with an arrest. Try to understand. If you can't understand it, look at legal terms. Ask a lawyer, and maybe then you'll know. And maybe you won't even want to go to jail for truancy. We'll be right back. Finally tonight, I want to show you this body cam viral break about a police chase that happened by a horse. Can you ever imagine a police chase on a horse? One Shadow Facts. Let's get that perk. Come on, Shadow Facts. And then you catch him. Take a look.
Stop! You're doing your thing! The sound of hooves galloping through a drugstore parking lot is not what people expect to hear. But in New Mexico, law enforcement may still arrive on horseback. Albuquerque police! Stop! You're doing your thing! Police say they were about to start a patrol shift and had just gotten the horses out of a trailer when a call came in about a suspected shoplifter at a Walgreens drugstore. Stop! Stop! You're being detained! The suspect ran into oncoming traffic trying to avoid the officer on horseback. Get on the ground! Get on the ground! You're being detained! No! Eventually, the suspect was surrounded by 3 large horses and officers, but he continued to walk in circles. You are being detained for suspected shoplifting! One of the officers dismounted and put the suspect in handcuffs. According to police, he allegedly stole $230 worth of merchandise from the store. There were no sirens or flashing lights, but these officers and their horses still got the job done. Hey, stop! You're doing your thing! This is Inside Edition Digital.
Wow. You can never imagine, like, oh my God, it's an officer on a horseback. You can't outrun a horse. But have you ever seen somebody running from the police on foot? I wouldn't. Just look up a video all about running from police on foot. This one will probably take the cake from you. This one will probably take the cake. Give it some popcorn.
Stop, Evan.
Now the audio was cut off and he was arrested. So what is that?
Put your hand behind your back. You got a gun?
Part of the audio was cut off. So what does that tell you? That tells you that you should not be running from the police. You should not, and you should also not talk back to an officer of the law. That's what tells you that you need to listen to an officer of the law. Alright, coming up tomorrow morning, probably tomorrow morning. No, next week. Next week, we're going to tell you those tobacco tapes. All about those tobacco tapes. Even you're going to hear from the tobacco industry, one of the tobacco industries that say on tape, all about nicotine and gummy bears. But The main event is happening next couple of days, this week. Sammy the Bull, the man who brought down John Gotti. It wasn't just, who was it? Bill Chihutter. It wasn't just a Filipino who brought down John Gotti. There was also one man by the name of Sammy Gravano, or Sammy the Bull. You will hear what he had to say when he joined the mob with John Gotti. And the victims who tell their side of the story about what happened with John Gotti. A Diane Sawyer exclusive that you will never want to miss. Sammy the Bull, the man who brought down John Gotti. That's on Wednesday and Friday. That's all for this edition of Give Me a Break Monday going to Tuesday. Join us again for Give Me a Break Wednesday. For everyone here at YouTube. Me, myself. Stop bullying, speak up. No texting and driving. No distracted driving. Concentration, not strength. No jaywalking. And no smoking. Have a good night.